And the case you reference, RaDonda Vaught, is the name of the nurse. And
Yes.
I wasn't there. I'm not an expert on the case, but from my reading of it, I mean, I've seen commentary, a lot of discussion online, even in nurse forums. Some nurses say, well, if you just read the label on the medication, like there's this hard line that says, it was egregious. But then, you raise different levels of punishment, losing your job, losing your license. Then there's the whole prosecution and conviction layer. And like reading what happened there, I mean, it seemed like there were many, many systemic factors. She was helping out by working in an area she was unfamiliar with. I think it was in, I believe, radiology, and it was somewhat unusual to have to sedate a patient for that. There were time pressures from the doctor and others. And then there was this culture of just kind of ignoring the need for overrides, and the factor, like you said, about the couple of letters. Like there were cultural factors. There could have been better error proofing in place to not set her up to fail. And I'm not a lawyer, but it seems like there's often kind of mitigate relative legal liability, where I don't think anyone is saying she's blameless, but it seems like the system and society is punishing her. And I don't know where the hospital is, and it seems like they're blaming the nurse when it begs questions of, so what are you doing to prevent this from happening again?
Right. And two points that you brought up. One, again, there's that very hardline culture, it's clearly marked as a paralytic, her mistake. I would never make that mistake. No one except someone who's really stupid and doesn't care would make that mistake. And that's it. Mm-hmm. And there is that strain in nursing. I know that. And it's probably there among physicians also. Mm-hmm. And it's so problematic. And like you just said, we can admit this was a very, very serious error. And she knows that. Like she never denied that. She reported it. And that's the other issue. And that actually, I just got my COVID booster last night, and the pharmacist was talking to me about this, just totally off the cuff, about we do not want a system that encourages people to lie and hide things.
Right. And it sounds like from my reading of the reports and everything that happened there, that this error could have been covered up. And I'm not saying people should cover it up, but I think that fear factor now will prevent people from speaking up in ways that would prevent future errors. That's why I think this transparency and this focus on learning and improvement more so than retribution and punishment is something people talk about in the patient safety movement. A lot of groups, the Institute for Safe Medication Practices and the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, and some leading voices in the healthcare quality movement has spoken up very loudly about how this conviction is a big setback for future patient safety.
Yeah, definitely. Because if you think, wow, if I make a mistake and I report this, okay, it's one thing to lose your job, to lose your license, to go to jail.
Right.
And I read the DA said, well, that the DA went out of his way to say, this is not about nurses. This is about this nurse, but also said, it's like she was driving drunk. And I thought, it's absolutely not like she was driving drunk. She was at work.
Right.
If she was drunk at work, okay, that's different. But she was working. She made a mistake, a very bad mistake within an incredibly chaotic system. And to get back to you saying, if she could have said, I have a concern, this looks very different from when I've given this drug before, I have to reconstitute it. It says, but it is very familiar to feel like, even though everyone says, oh, ask, if you have a question, ask. But then
Yeah.
it can be, you don't know that. Like, what are you thinking?
Sure. The shaming that comes from speaking up, and you write a lot, Theresa, about maybe the word pride applies. You wrote in Healing how it wasn't easy to write about a mistake that you disclosed. You wrote about in your book, The Shift, giving an injection of a steroid. Can you tell that story briefly, and like some of the your reflection on why it was difficult to even put that into writing?
Yeah. So very quickly, that I was working outpatient oncology at that point, and someone had been ordered, I'll just make this up, let's say 45 milligrams of, let's say 60 milligrams of dexamethasone. And because I don't remember the exact details, and it comes in 20 milligram vials. So I went and pulled up 3 20 milligram vials into a syringe and gave it slowly to the patient.
And I think you said it was like 3 times what the normal injection might be. It might normally be a vial.
Right. Yes. And so I thought, this is really weird. I've never done this before. But we were working with a bunch of different doctors. And, that's the other thing with the problem of lack of standardization. So you just kind of felt like, well, this is weird, but we do a lot of weird. So, and then I was looking at the order, which I think had been faxed in, and written over on the side, very, very pale, was to put the dexamethasone in a small bag and run it over 15 minutes. So I literally, when I saw that, I literally wanted the ground to open up and swallow me. I felt so terrible. And told the supervisor, and she said, go call the doctor. And the doctor was fabulous. Like, he said, oh, yeah, I don't think that's going to, it might cause her pressure to drop. So monitor that. Yeah, it's fine. Very reassuring, just really wonderful, because I felt so bad. And that's the other problem in nursing. At least there's this culture of you can never make a mistake. And the reality is, we're human. We're going to make mistakes. And so then you need to create a system that makes mistakes a lot less likely. So like I say, why can't we have a standardized order form? Why does every doctor use their own form instead of...
Well, and why are we relying? I mean, it seems like such a vivid illustration of a system problem, that faint handwriting, which might not have looked faint originally, but however it came through the fax didn't come through well. And like you said, if it's not a standardized form in some way, I would make the case you weren't set up for success there.
Yes. And that gets me to another thought I often had as a nurse, that healthcare is still such an oral culture. And it's as if we haven't adapted to the complexity of so many more drugs than they had 50 years ago, so many more technologies. And as a patient, I really felt that. I didn't understand, why can't they just give me a piece of paper that says, here's an algorithm of what might happen. Here's the order we would like things to go in for you. And then on the other side could be a list of physicians, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they gave me the names of some surgeons. And again, I asked my friend for a recommendation. Very, it's the rare person, right, who has a breast surgeon who's a good friend. But the lack of anything in writing, like, we know that people go into appointments and they don't hear what is said well. And my husband would come with me. So between the two of us, it was like we would have one brain, because he had his own feelings about his wife having breast cancer.
Right.
And I felt like every time I should leave with a piece of paper that tells me something.
I mean, I've heard patients who want to record those visits, and sometimes doctors don't want them doing that. It's for their own reference. So I could go back when I'm maybe in a different state of mind or clear-headed to go back and make sure I heard it correctly. Because even notes could be incomplete or inaccurate.
Right. And that is really, really a puzzle to me, or why there isn't, I mean, every hospital could do it, or we could have a national database, but of course then everybody would argue about what goes in it. But sort of, here's the 10-minute video you can watch about having breast cancer. And there was a video they made about exercises to do after lumpectomy, which I did. But that there's app, like, where's the breast cancer app, that you can.
I mean, I think there are online communities. I have friends who have been cancer patients where they really rely on kind of a peer group network of other patients. There's a Society for Empowered Patients. I forget I think I have the name slightly wrong, but people are trying to fill in those gaps in different ways.
Yeah, and that's where I found help with tamoxifen. I, as I talk about in the book, I made a decision to try and not spend a lot of time online, because I'd seen so many patients and family members look online and end up being terrified by what they saw there. But I did find some chat groups talking about tamoxifen and how hard it was to be on it, and that made me feel a lot less alone. That was very helpful.
One other thing I wanted to ask you about, and this is something you wrote about in The Shift, and you did use the phrase "too proud." You wrote about being too proud to speak up, to share a concern with a manager that a shift's assignment was, as you called it, potentially overwhelming. Curious to hear, your thoughts on that, and then there's kind of a follow-up question when it comes to nurses being overburdened and nurse-patient ratios. Your thoughts about different efforts to sort of try to mandate limits on patient-nurse ratios.
Yeah. Again, the question you asked is another one of these situations where whatever gets thrown at you, you're supposed to be able to take it. And to say, this is too much, why am I the person who has 5 patients? Or, why do I have the person who needs chemo every 2 hours? I mean, one day at work, we had a protocol that basically was chemo almost every 2 hours. It's one of the pre-transplant protocols where we're sort of just wiping out their immune system. And I had 2 patients on that protocol that day. But there's this feeling of, and it's probably my personality, probably the culture of, I don't want to be that person who's quote unquote whining. This is too much for me. I can't do this. Instead of like an adult saying,
sure, this
is not a safe apportionment of patients, which, that's a problem. But I do agree with staffing ratios, because unfortunately it seems like that's the only way to get enough nurses on staff. And I've said this so many times, and I'm sure the people listening to this podcast, most of them are aware of this issue, but because nurses don't bring in income, we're seen as an area of labor costs only. And so, we want to cut labor costs, let's cut nurses. I'm sure it's never quite that cut and dried, but that's how it feels when you're working on the floor. And then there are these situations where you're always working a little bit harder than you should be. You have too much to do than you can really get done. And it's not a question of laziness or not wanting to work hard. It's about not being able to give patients the attention they absolutely need. And, I worked with very sick patients who were often getting blood transfusions, who were getting chemotherapy, who were getting experimental drugs, who were at risk of systemic side effects, neurological problems that would onset because of some of the infections that could come with the stem cell transplant. They were on immune suppression. They were really, really complicated patients. And a nurse needs to have time to have eyes on those patients, as we call it. So I wish I didn't feel like ratios were necessary, but it seems like nothing else is maybe going to make that happen. And the one thing I wish people would think about also is there is data coming out now that shows the cost of not having enough nurses. So, urinary tract infections go up, falls go up. I'm imagining that civil suits sometimes go up, or malpractice suits go up. But I feel like the people who deal with that pot of money don't talk to the people who are looking at the labor pot of money. And I really would like for those two people to talk to each other. And that, there could be a sense of, we're investing in the overall good environment for our patients. I just read this book called, it's right here, Patients Come Second.
Oh, yes. I've interviewed Paul, is it Spiegelman?
Spiegelman, yeah.
He's one of the authors. Yeah.
I've
interviewed him.
And wrote about it for the American Journal of Nursing, about invest in your staff and you're going to get good results, which just makes sense to me from an experiential perspective. I wish they had had more data in this book about money. But the argument is great, and it makes sense to me. And now all these issues are so important because we're coming off COVID. A lot of nurses have quit. Nurses have left regular jobs to become travel nurses. So we have ended up with this healthcare environment that is fragmented, even if it's well-staffed, and maybe well-staffed by people who have no loyalty to that particular institution, which I don't mean they're disloyal. I just mean they don't know who the people are. They're not there for the long haul. They're there to show up, do their job, and then leave. And they may be fantastic at doing their job, but this whole relational piece is going to be missing. And you need that.
Well, I could see where if the nurses aren't feeling properly taken care of, for lack of a better word, properly supported in their work environment in different ways, the temptation would be to say, well, if it's going to be lousy, I might as well get paid more to put up with lousy. And that's unfortunate. That it even gets to that. You talk about staffing levels. You also write, a lot in the shift about, like, under your theme of just, you're supposed to just take it, like nurses not getting breaks or time to eat. That has a direct impact on fatigue and errors and the health of staff members. That sounds like a systemic issue. You write about some of the trade-offs of, like, the 12-hour shifts are shown to increase the risk of errors because of fatigue. But then people will say, well, but now we get better continuity of care. Like, well, do you want, like, how can we have both? Can we improve the shift handoff process in a way that reduces fatigue without creating other problems? I threw a lot at you there, but I'm just curious your thoughts around the issues of fatigue from shift length and breaks and lunches. What can or should we do about that?
Those are such great questions. And I'm thinking we would often say on the job, I wish I could get a break where I could leave. I need to get something from the drugstore. And there was one that was about a 7-minute walk away. I wish on my lunch break I could walk to the drugstore, pick up what I need, and come back. But you can't, because who's going to take your phone? And I think it's really hard for people to understand what it almost feels like being a servant in a way that, you can't leave the hospital because there's no one to take your phone for you. And your phone is your connection to everything that's going on with your patients. And there are hospitals where they have lunch nurses come in. And then there are, because I know when I went to MD Anderson a few years ago to give a talk, they said then the problem they had was nurses saying, well, I can't leave my patients, this sort of, no one can take care of my patients as well as I can. Like, yeah, for half an hour, someone else can take care of your patients. So it can become a kind of, again, that sort of, I would call it a maladaptation to the work environment, is no one can do this as well as I can.
Yeah.
So that is definitely a problem, that walking across the street to go to Starbucks felt like a huge treat because you actually got to get outside and breathe some fresh air and just leave that environment. And everyone needs breaks. Wait, there was another really important thing you asked me. Can you remind me what the...
So talking about the 12-hour shifts and the dynamic of fatigue versus handoffs between shifts.
So this was fascinating to me. When the shift came out, I did a whole bunch of interviews similar to this one. And these were just interviews by all kinds of people, right? Like mostly radio people, not healthcare people, the point being. And to a person, pretty much they all asked me about 12-hour shifts. And they didn't ask me like, they asked me like, isn't that a really bad idea? And it stunned me because I thought, in a good way though, because I had no idea the public thought about that or cared about that. And I would say, yeah, you're right. There's clear evidence that after 10 hours, errors go up.
Right.
And it was clear that people would feel better if nurses did not work 12-hour shifts. So yes, you get to the sticking point though, which is, and I've said this, if I have my patients for 12 hours, I don't have to worry that any balls are going to get dropped. Again, it's that kind of, I'm looking out for them and, which we are, but yes, couldn't we do handoffs better? Couldn't we have an electronic record system that was actually helpful, rather than just being sort of a mass of data that seems like it does, nothing for the people actually using it? I mean, just imagine if you actually really had a task list that was real tasks that you had to get done. And I would just add to that during the day. So the person coming to take over for me would have that. It would just already be there. These are the really important things you're going to need to think about. Because we do handoffs, but to think if it could be built into the electronic record would be one. I mean, that's a whole nother piece, like why we have these electronic health records that don't do anything for the actual clinicians. But yeah, it's interesting too, when interns had their hours restricted, there was a lot of complaining, right? That, well, we're not getting that continuity of care. And then it turned, people start talking about it, it turns out that their handoffs are terrible.
Right.
That they were so bad at handoffs. And, I said, so improve the handoff.
That's fixable. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. But that gets to another problem of, but we've always done it this way. And we're all supposed to be these really smart, educated people. Right. And this is, I love telling this story. On the bone marrow transplant unit, we had one of the drug rooms where the Pyxis was, and there was the Pyxis and then a refrigerator, and the refrigerator door opened out. So if someone was getting medications out of the refrigerator, nobody else could use the Pyxis, right? It's not well done. And I was in there one day, and one of the facilities people was in there, and he said, you know what? I can move that door. So it would open the other way. And I was in a hurry, and I said, you know what? When I first started working here, I would have really cared about that. Now I don't even think about it.
Get used to it.
Yeah. And it's like I'd gotten conditioned to think of everything being harder than it needs to be.
Yeah. And so that point, before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, there's overwork, there's fatigue, and then unfortunately there's burnout. You said in the shift, this is another thing I highlighted here, one of the key factors in burnout is employees feeling like they have very little control over their work environment. that's pretty much status quo in hospitals for nurses and doctors. That's one thing at Value Capture we really try to help change, that culture where it's not even feeling like it's actually having control over
Wow.
elements of the work environment. And it's sad to hear you, to see you write. I probably wouldn't disagree with it from my observations of that being the status quo, of having little control over the work environment, of just fighting through things, working around, tolerating, getting used to instead of improving. It's a big, heavy question, but have you seen, or do you have thoughts on how we can start shifting some control of that environment to the caregivers?
Yeah, that is a great question. And for me, and I've written about this, and I know this is a multi-million-dollar problem, but
Mm-hmm.
how the electronic health records we use now are mostly set up for billing.
Right.
They take a huge amount of time. Things are always being added on to them, so we have to do more. And I found that just enormous in terms of taking me away from the bedside, this incredible amount of pressure I felt to get the charting done every day. And then it's not useful to me. Like, so much of the information was not useful, which gets back to, why when I go in for a mammogram, do I have to write down all that information? Well, because they can't print it out easily in a way that's useful.
Mm-hmm.
So why do we have record systems like that? I know the answer to that question.
Yeah.
So that's one thing, because it just eats up a huge amount of time. And then it's this weird thing where we get judged on our charting.
Mm.
In nursing school, you're taught if it isn't charted, it isn't done.
Right.
And the presumption is if it's not charted, you didn't do it. There's never a presumption that, well, you just didn't get it charted.
Mm-hmm.
And I, for whatever reason, found that just incredibly difficult. I know I'm not alone in that, though. That's a pretty common feeling. And the other thing would be, to get rid of that toxic culture that's so suspicious of people saying, I have a concern, or I'm not really sure how I'm supposed to handle this patient. I mean, this did happen to me once. Someone getting continuous bladder irrigation, and on the floor, 4 patients was standard. And then we were getting an admission, a family that was notoriously difficult to handle. And my manager gave me that couple. And so here I got someone, continuous bladder irrigation means they have to constantly be getting fluid going through their bladder, and you can't let it run dry. And then all of a sudden I'm getting an admission of a family that when they show up, the wife wants this and 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 this. And my manager knew that. And I didn't feel like I can say, how exactly am I supposed to be doing continuous bladder irrigation when Mrs. X is going to want me to be in their room for an hour when they first get here? So instead of having a sense of assignments or sort of punishments or challenges, there just needs to be so much more of a sense of what is good care. Mm-hmm. And for me, that really comes down to professionalism. Mm-hmm. And, the letting people be nasty to each other, criticizing someone because they called a code and maybe they shouldn't have. All this, you can call it all different things, but to me, it's a lack of professionalism.
Right.
And if someone says, I have a concern, the first response should be, I have to listen to that. So those are 2 things I can think of, right?
Yeah. Right.
Off the top of my head. And if there was more help available, in nursing, it drove me nuts to have the charge nurse be someone who would just walk around with a clipboard, would never help.
Yeah.
And I gave a talk at Intermountain. Actually, they have a book club and they read The Shift. They had me come out to talk about The Shift.
Yeah.
And I was talking about how you have some charge nurses will take every admission and get that person settled. And then they hand them off to a nurse. And some walk around with a clipboard and they don't do anything. I don't know what they're doing with that clipboard.
Yeah.
And they said at Intermountain that they had just standardized the role of the charge nurse. And there were people who said they didn't want to do it anymore.
Well, there's something else they could do maybe then. Because if they're not supporting the nurses in the patient care, I mean, sometimes redefining that leadership role means other people are going to select out or select in. Maybe that's for the best. Yeah,
no, I agree with you. And as a new nurse, we had a nurse practitioner who was supposed to help on the floor, and she would say, well, if you're feeling stuck, ask the clinicians. And it was the clinicians who were the worst bullies. That was my first job. And I remember once going to this is not going to work because of this person, but this is what I was told to do. So I'm going to do it. And said, can you help me with this? And she just looked at me like I was an idiot and said, no.
Yeah.
So to feel like, I feel like I'm drowning. Could someone come help me? Well, the water's still here instead of, here.
Yeah.
That would be huge.
Well, so as we wrap up, Theresa, and thank you for spending so much time with me here today. Again, our guest has been Theresa Brown, author of books including The Shift. Again, that was a New York Times bestseller. Her new book, her very personal journey as a patient. The book is called Healing: When a Nurse Becomes a Patient. And at the end here, I just wanted to share, I mean, in the epilogue, you said, as a nurse, I told myself that if the system failed patients, I could make up for it by working harder, better, and longer. Sometimes that was true. But then you say you have to admit any one person giving 120% to the job, just to paraphrase, can't balance out the problems in the system. It leads to fatigue. It leads to burnout from people having to do too much. So that's something we're inspired to try to help change those circumstances, those systems, that culture, as you described so vividly in your books and as you did here today. So I'll leave you with the final word. If there's anything else that you want to add on that, or anything else you want to say to wrap up.
Oh, thanks, Mark. Well, this has been really fun, and I think the strength of this and the work you do is the thoughtfulness that goes into it. And I think most people in healthcare are good people. They want the best results. And I think that goes all up the chain of command. And we need more thoughtfulness about what people are going through and what the people who take care of them are also going through.
Well, thank you for sharing. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm hoping for a reset after COVID. That's my wish.
I hope we get that. And I want to thank you, Theresa, for sharing, all of your stories and your experiences and your efforts to help open people's eyes and do things to help drive improvement to the systems for patients, for caregivers, for everybody involved. So thank you. Thank you again for joining us today.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
So again, we've been joined by Theresa Brown. Her website is theresabrownrn.com. Please look in the show notes to look for links to her books and the website. Thanks again.
You're welcome.